Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales, so I'm on Gadigal land where I live, work and write. I pay my sincere respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us here this morning. Welcome. My name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship here at the library, and it's great to be here with you this morning to bring you another instalment in our Scholar Talks series. We're doing these online so that we can record them and people can enjoy these talks again later on, or for the first time if you've missed out on one of our fellows delivering and talking about the research that they've done here at the library. If you have any questions, you can just use the chat feature on Zoom and we'll come to those questions at the end of today's talk. So today we have Dr. Isabel Barrett-Meiring, and she was our 2019 David Scott Mitchell Fellow and is of course an historian at Macquarie University. Today, Isabel is talking about her time here at the library as a fellow and her work on Making Theatre That Matters, which was an exploration of children's rights activism in the 1970s and 1980s. Thanks, Isabel.
Hi, I'm just going to share my screen with you. So thank you very much for joining us today for this talk. It's really exciting to be able to present this research to you. I'd like to start, like Rachel, by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples on whose lands we are all gathering today, wherever we are coming to this talk from. And in particular, I'm speaking to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the library for the chance to undertake this research and for the support provided by the fellowship program, which I think is also especially important for early career researchers like myself. I want to thank Rachel in particular for the support she provides to fellows in her role coordinating the program. And I also want to thank all the staff in the Mitchell Library who facilitate this research. I've spent a lot of time in the library over the years, not only for this project, but for other research that I've undertaken through the library. And it really helps to have people there who can answer your questions and who are always willing to go that extra effort to bring extra trolleys of material down. I know that there are also some members of Pippi Storm here today, and that's the group that I'm going to be talking about. And I also want to thank them for the interest that they've shown in the project, and also for their offers of assistance as this research continues to go forward as part of the broader work that I'm doing on the history of children's rights in Australia. And I want to, in particular, thank Peter Winkler and Brian Joyce for reaching out to me at various points. I'm conscious that the perspective that I'm going to be presenting during this talk is one shaped by my own interests as a researcher, and it will probably emphasise certain aspects of the group's history more than others. Of course, this is also only a relatively short talk, but either way, what I hope it really underlines is the important contribution that Pippi Storm members made to Australian children's culture and children's lives in the 1970s and 1980s. The talk today is titled Making Theatre That Matters. And as I was finishing preparing the talk, it did occur to me that that title might be a bit of a misnomer. One could, of course, say that theatre matters full stop, that it is intrinsically important as a cultural form. But I think the intention behind theatre does also make a difference. And when I chose the title, I was thinking about one of the main objectives identified by Pippi Storm, which was to use theatre to effect change, to provide ideas and positive alternatives. This objective reflected the strong social justice ethos that underpinned Pippi Storm's work. And one of the main ways that that manifested was in a commitment to empowering children through theatre. This is what first brought Pippi Storm's work to my attention and made me think about how investigating it might help illuminate the ways in which understandings of children's rights were changing in the 1970s and 1980s. In this talk today, I'm going to try to give you a general sense of the group's history as it's recorded in the library's archival collection and how it relates to the wider social and political context of the period, one in which new ideas about children's rights were being tested. I also want to use this talk to give you a bit of a taste of what is actually held in the library's collection and to really sort of highlight some of the exciting material that's there. Particularly because there are other uses that could be made of this material. In particular, I've approached this collection from the point of view of being a historian of children's rights and childhood more generally. But of course, there are broader stories to tell here about the history of theatre, of community theatre, alternative theatre, children's and youth theatre. And the material is really such a rich collection that it could be used to I think in future to fuel other projects as well. So in the next half hour or so, I'm going to start by giving a broad history of an overview of the history of the group, its aims and the different kinds of theatre it produced. I'm then going to talk a little bit about how this project relates to some of the other research that I've done and highlight and sort of give an overview of what the library's collection contains and how that might relate to histories of children's rights more generally. And I'm then going to focus on 3 ways in which I think Pippi Storm's work can contribute to a history of children's rights and give some specific examples of that. The first is in terms of understanding children's rights as a thematic focus of Pippi Storm's work. The second way I think we can look at it is in terms of children's rights as a principle underpinning its broader approach to theatre as a way to empower children and young people. And I think the third way we can understand Pippi Storm as contributing to the history of children's rights is through the work it's undertaken in terms of acknowledging children's right to culture itself, and in particular to culture that is meaningful and relevant to them. I think that was a core value of the group through this period. So for a brief overview of the history of the group, Pippi Storm Theatre Company was a dedicated children's and youth theatre, as you probably gathered by now, that performed in schools, welfare institutions and community venues across New South Wales and beyond up until the late 1980s. It had its origins in 2 small Sydney-based groups that formed separately in 1975, the Pippi Storm Circus and the Bunyip Children's Band. Members of Pippi Storm Circus included Russell Cheek, Margaret Fisher, Bronwyn Vaughan, Stuart Gray, Brian Joyce and Murray Oliver in its early years. The Bunyip Children's Band included Peter Winkler, Les Dupont-Lewis, Chrissy Shaw, David Webster, Linda Batterham, Greg Fitzgerald, Bruce Lanahan and Peter O'Brien. And I hope I haven't missed anyone there. Some of the records, obviously one of the issues in terms of written records is they may or may not emphasise or capture everyone who's involved in a group in its early years in particular before more formalised records are kept. But I did want to make sure I acknowledged some of those who I am aware of. Both groups started out performing at public fairs and festivals, but had gone on to extend their reach in other ways. Pippi Storm Circus, for example, had received several grants, enabling it to undertake tours in regional New South Wales. In 1978, the 2 groups came together and formed Pippi Storm Theatre Company, which was an incorporated company but operated as a collective with members all having a say in decision making. The objectives of the group were set out in a range of different documents, including in funding applications, but I've taken these from its 1979 annual report. As you can see, there's 4 objectives. Firstly, to provide children of all ages with a stimulating, dramatic, theatrical and musical experience, an exciting learning situation and a chance to master new skills. Secondly, to offer specific programs with relevance to the needs of the community or group involved. Thirdly, to concentrate our programs in areas of greatest need, economic, emotional, geographical and cultural. And finally, to effect change, providing ideas and positive alternatives. And that's the objective that I highlighted earlier on. Pippi Storm Circus and the Bunbury Children's Band had both operated as relatively small groups, but following the merging of them, the group grew. By 1979, there were 21 members documented in the annual report, and the company also was employing a full-time paid coordinator. Members of the group came from different backgrounds. They included professional actors, musicians, teachers, childcare workers, and children's services and youth workers. Many were also involved in other social projects, and they brought diverse political interests to their work, including involvement in feminism, anti-racist activism, union work, radical education, and children's rights. As with any group of this kind, some stayed involved in the group for many years, while others came and went. And over the course of time, they developed a wide-ranging program. I can only really briefly speak to this program today. One of the kind of mainstays of their work were theatre workshops, where participants were taught circus and other performance skills, from juggling to stilt walking. And this flyer that you can see here is one taken from the early 1980s, but these workshops were ones that they offered from the beginning. The workshops were run not only in schools, but also in other community venues, and crucially in children's institutions. And I'm going to come back to that aspect of their work briefly a little later. Another of Pippi Storm's signature programs was its Parks program, launched in 1979 and involving circus activities in community parks on weekends and during school holidays. And I guess to give you a sense of the kind of impact of that program, one of the figures cited in the 1979 annual report is an estimate that they had about 150 people attending on any single day on a weekend, and over 10,000 people therefore estimated as having participated in them over the course of the year. And that was just one program. Pippi Storm also produced its own original plays and musical reviews. You can see one of them here, Fairy Tale Alternatives. Many of these addressed key social issues of the times, including the case of Fairy Tale Alternatives, the issue of sexism, but they also took up other themes, issues around sexuality, the media, drug use, family breakdown, child abuse, employment issues, a whole range of issues. Finally, Pippi Storm developed extended collaborations with a range of local communities, with a focus on Western Sydney from the early 1980s onwards. So as you can see, it was an ambitious program of activities, and it enabled Pippi Storm to reach tens of thousands of children, parents, teachers, and other community members over the course of its history. In order to fund its work, Pippi Storm members dedicated significant time to pursuing grant opportunities, and this is underlined by the large quantities of funding applications that are held in the library's papers. Key sources of funding included the Schools Commission, the Australia Council, and various New South Wales government departments. Pippi Storm also received some funding from local government and certainly support from local groups, and also some philanthropic funding over time. So while this talk and my work more generally has focused on Pippi Storm, it's also important to note that it formed part of a vibrant alternative theatre and community theatre scene in Australia in the 1970s and 80s, and that in particular children's and youth theatre was one of the areas that thrived. While I haven't looked closely at other examples of theatre in this time, it is clear to me that Pippi Storm wasn't alone in identifying the potential for theatre to affect social change. But it was one of the preeminent groups of the period. And so when I came across it originally, I was surprised to find that its history had so far been little documented. It is mentioned in key theatre histories, but only briefly. Theatre studies scholar Gillian Arrighi has also noted its important role in the revival of circus skills within the community theatre in Australia and the egalitarian ethos that underpinned that work. And Brian Joyce, one of the very early members of the group, has also examined its work as an example of community development, noting the ways in which Pippi Storm and its put into practice its commitment to social change, participation, and collaboration. But with those few exceptions, the group's history has been little documented. This is clearly not due to a lack of records. just to give you a sense of what is held in the library's collection of papers. These are some of the kinds of materials we can find there. They include typical organisational records, annual reports, funding applications, as I've mentioned, financial records and correspondence files, as well as promotional materials and press clippings highlighting the sort of impact that it had more widely. For some projects, there are evaluation reports that were undertaken for funding bodies. Sometimes there are audience surveys or letters of appreciation that schools sent to provide comments on the performances. In some cases, there are also additional materials relating to programs such as resource kits that were developed for teachers to plan lessons and activities as follow-up to their performances. There are also many photographs and several scrapbook collections which document particular programs. And there are also films of some productions. I haven't focused on those myself in this research, but clearly for theatre historians, that is an incredibly valuable resource. Finally, there are also some materials that speak to the different community groups and other theatre groups that that Pippi Storm was connected to during this period. And some of those help to understand, I think, the broader context in which its work took place. Now, archival records, of course, have their limitations. I've already mentioned that it can be hard to work out exactly who was another member at different points in the group, particularly because formal documentation like that was developed later on. Nonetheless, archival records can tell us a lot about this subject. And in particular, I think they're invaluable because they help put Pippi Storm into a wider context by documenting a sort of interaction between the group and other people at the time. Things like funding submissions can help us show how Pippi Storm tried to present its work to others who might be sympathetic to it, how they made the case in the process for children's rights as an important social issue. Things like audience surveys and letters that the group received from schools help us understand what those who watched the plays and others and participated in theatre workshops, what they gained from that experience and what message they took away. Now, I myself first came across Pippi Storm when I was undertaking my PhD research on the concept of children's liberation as part of Australian feminist activism in the 1970s. It's research which I'm pleased to say is coming out later this year in the form of my book, Feminism and the Making of the Child Rights Revolution. In this book, I explore how the ideas of women's liberation and children's liberation went alongside each other in the 1970s, and how feminists contributed to a more critical discussion of the politics of childhood in this period. And one of the people who's most associated with this approach is Shulamith Firestone, a North American radical feminist who published this book, The Dialectic of Sex, in 1970, in which she argued that children's liberation was central to the feminist project. Her ideas certainly made an impact in Australia, and you can see here also a piece that Anne Summers wrote called Free the Children, published in the Adelaide University student newspaper On Dit in 1971. One of the areas that I looked at while I was undertaking this research was the emergence of feminist children's culture, from feminist books and toys for children to theatre and music shows. I was struck in many cases that these cultural works weren't just concerned with themes of non-sexism, they also encouraged children to question broader assumptions about adult authority and social conformity. And it was while I was researching that book that I came across some of the plays of Pippi Storm, which were sometimes addressing issues such as non-sexism and sometimes addressing other aspects of children's rights in this period. And I'll come back and talk about some of those examples a little later on. Since then, I've embarked on a broader project on the history of children's rights in Australia, covering the period from 1959 to 2013. And what is a distinguishing feature of this broader period in terms of a longer history of children's rights is a shift from a focus on protection to participation. And with it, new ideas about children's agency and children's capacity to make decisions for themselves. This is a kind of a broad shift that takes place, but it's by no means one that's that's uncontested. And these ideas go alongside each other today still, protection and participation as two aspects of children's rights discourse. The period during which Pippi Storm operated was one in which these ideas about participation were becoming increasingly influential though. From radical calls for children's liberation, such as calls made by Shulma Firestone, to an emphasis in more general terms on giving children more say in their lives, in their decisions around family, in their decisions around schooling, and for those in institutions, giving them more say in their care. So these ideas were being developed in a range of different arenas. Certainly, their impact was felt particularly strongly in the education arena. The late 1960s and 1970s were a period when we see some radical writings on the subject of education, challenging authoritarian teacher-student relationships, and more generally questioning the way in which schools serve to institutionalize people in different ways. And those ideas are particularly associated with Ivan Illich and his book, Deschooling Society in 1971, but they were expressed by a range of other radical educationalists in this period as well. These ideas were also articulated in texts like The Little Red School Book, which was published in 1969 in Denmark and translated and became an international text, really sort of seen as the kind of outstanding youth text of the period. It arrived in Australia in 1972 and quickly caused controversy, both over its advocacy of student power in schools and also because it touched on issues such as sexuality and drugs that were considered controversial. Teachers sympathetic to these views, I think, worked in many different ways to bring them into the classroom though. This period does see the establishment of a range of alternative schools, but it wasn't just in alternative schools that questions around the relationships between students and teachers were being challenged, and teachers more generally who were sympathetic to these views were trying to implement more democratic forms of teaching in their classrooms, trying to open up space for non-traditional forms of learning. And this is an area where Pippi Storm, I think, connects with what was taking place in the broader educational setting in this period. More generally, this is an issue in which questions around education and social equality are being raised. In 1972, the Whitlam government was elected, amongst other things, on a platform of expanding funding for education, which Whitlam saw as key to social equality. One of Whitlam's first initiatives was to announce the formation of an interim committee for the Australian Schools Commission, and its 1973 report, which you can see here, argued for increased funding and also highlighted issues of specific educational disadvantage, Aboriginal children, migrant children and girls, amongst others. And those issues were ones that the Schools Commission subsequently took up, including in the report Girls, School and Society, which came out in 1975. The Schools Commission went on to fund programs that were intended to support innovative projects in schools, as well as running its Disadvantaged Schools program, which provided specific funding to projects in disadvantaged areas. And Pippi Storm was one of the early beneficiaries of this funding. This is also a period in which gender roles, the family and sexuality are central to public debate due to the emergence of the women's liberation and gay liberation movements in the early 1970s. I've already mentioned the Little Red School Book, the controversy it sparked around questions around children's sexuality and access to things like sex education, which was a key issue of the times. Sex education was one of the issues also taken up by the Royal Commission on Human Relationships in its report, which came out in 1977. And it also addressed other issues, such as girls' access to contraception and abortion. Questions around gender and family were also fueling activism in the child welfare space. In Sydney, for example, the women's liberation movement joined with civil libertarian groups, social workers and social justice lawyers to campaign against the mistreatment of girls in institutions. They held a range of protests in late 1973 and early 1974, in which they highlighted the conditions in welfare institutions, as well as issues such as lack of education or opportunity for those residing in them. As a result of those campaigns, some of the most notorious institutions where girls were placed were closed in the mid-1970s, such as Parramatta Girls Training Home, which you see pictured here. Following on from campaigns like this, one of the election promises of the Rann Labor government in New South Wales in 1976 was to overhaul the child welfare system. And this proved to be a lengthy process, but ultimately led to some reforms in the area in 1982. And over the course of the 1980s, there were continued questions being raised about child welfare legislation that led to further reforms at the end of the decade. Crucially, this was also a period in which Aboriginal activists were working to bring public attention to the long history of Aboriginal child removal and its effects on their families. Finally, this was a time when lawyers were working to raise questions around children's rights in the legal arena more generally, and working to provide new forms of legal education. The late 1970s see the establishment of the first community legal centres in New South Wales, firstly the Redfern Legal Centre in 1977, then the Marrickville Legal Centre in 1979. And those two centres were both involved in the production of this inner city survival manual in 1983, which, as you can see from the list of contents, include an entire section on law. So this is the broader context, I think, in which Pippi Storm's work is taking place, and they're certainly taking note of some of these initiatives. I want to now, for the rest of the talk, just speak to those three areas that I suggested at the beginning, that are ways in which I think we can locate Pippi Storm's work as part of this broader resurgence of ideas around children's rights. Firstly, I think we can see this new interest in children's rights and new understandings of children's rights that are emerging in the 1970s in particular, as something that reflected in the thematic focus of Pippi Storm's work. They saw theatre as a conduit for broader debates about social inequalities and their impact on the lives of children. And in addition, some of their works explicitly focused on children and young people's rights in the context of child welfare, in relation to policing and the court system, and in relation to drug use as well. So the play that's really stood out to me in this respect is Says Who, which emerged from a collaboration between two members, Brian Joyce and Julie McCrossan. It's centred around an encounter between two girls, Tony and Sky, outside the children's court, where both of them are about to come before the magistrate. You can see here flyers for the program, for the play from 1981-82 originally, and then a subsequent flyer for it from 1983. The play is told in the form of a series of flashbacks in which the audience is guided through the events leading up to each of the girls' court appearances. Other scenes show the court process, in which they're depicted as largely being excluded. They have little understanding of what takes place. The lawyers and the judge make decisions without their real involvement. And their predicament is summarised in the pamphlet that was used to promote the production. There are many laws, rules and regulations that govern our lives as we grow up, it stated. They wait for us. Written for the protection of children by adults, but often we only learn about them when we break them. Indeed, I think a key message of the play was that laws ostensibly made for the protection of children could also be used to disenfranchise them. And if the audience surveys evaluations are anything to go by, then the message that children needed to be more aware of how the legal system operated was certainly one that they grasped. These are some of the quotes that emerged from audience surveys, most of them from students who would have seen the plays in schools, sometimes from teachers reporting on students' views, but I've tried to select here ones that are clearly from students. It's not always possible to demarcate the two. The first one, the performance of Says Who helps us show us the trouble we can get ourselves into over fairly small things. It also helps us understand our rights, the student said. Another one that stood out to me, although there was not enough time to tell us all our rights regarding the law, it helped us to realise we should know our rights and stand up for them. The message that this student took away from the play was a need to assert themselves in the legal system. I think it could also, of course, people take other messages away from the play and see it as a warning not to break the law. We have a little bit of a sense of that here from the third quote. So there are obviously different interpretations that the audience made over time, but on the whole, the message that comes through from these surveys is really a sense that students needed to be more aware of their rights, and that, and I guess we get a sense as a result that theatre and performances like this are one way in which discussions around those issues could be generated. The second way in which I think we can look at the way in which Pippi Storm illuminates understandings of children's rights in this period is by considering children's rights as a principle that underpinned its broader approach to using theatre to empower children and young people. So, as I mentioned, the concept of children's participation is one that's a key shift in children's rights discourse in this period, and in more radical manifestations, this idea is linked to ideas about challenging age hierarchies and recognising children's voice. Now, Pippi Storm repeatedly described its work as based on principles of participation and emphasised that they also wanted to encourage children to be involved in non-competitive ways. Their programs complemented the efforts of progressive teachers to promote non-traditional forms of learning and to open up the classroom. In their 1978 report, for example, the group emphasised the importance of experience over accomplishment, noting that their workshops emphasised gaining confidence and self-esteem, not only learning to perform tricks. They also implemented this principle in their plays and musical theatre through various forms of audience participation. In Says Who, for example, the audience was given an opportunity to provide their own directions to the actors and shape the development of the performance. So the 1978 report on Pippi Storm and its workshops also concluded that the experience of working with children had reinforced our beliefs that kids are individuals, that kids and adults can have relationships on an equal footing, and that those relationships can be rich and satisfying. This emphasis on participation was an especially important feature, I think, of their work in institutional settings. Sorry, this one relates to their theatre workshops, and I guess was meant to show this earlier, but shows you just some of the activities that you can see children participating in. The work that Pippi Storm undertook in the institutions took place in a range of contexts, but two programs in particular were undertaken that are well documented in the archives. One is the 1979 program, which saw them offering theatre workshops in 25 child welfare institutions in New South Wales. This included institutions in the Sydney metropolitan area, as well as in Newcastle, Mittagong and the Blue Mountains. And a follow-up to this program was a 1981 program that focused more closely on 3 institutions where they worked for 10 weeks. So that allowed for the development of sort of longer programs and closer relationships with the children there. And you can see these two quotes here from the evaluation report from 1979 that I think indicate how the group saw itself as offering something that was not available to children otherwise in these institutions. The group emphasised that through their programs, children had an opportunity to make decisions for themselves, to decide what activities to pursue and for how long, and that this was a unique experience for kids who live in a world of fixed schedules for everything they do. The second quote here underlines their concerns more generally about the disciplinary style within these institutions, which they contrast with their own non-authoritarian, non-competitive approach to working with kids. The contrast in particular between the emphasis on correction and doing your time in institutions versus the facilitating of children's individuality and self-expression, which was a key aim of their programs. So the third way in which I think we can think about children's rights in relationship to Pippi Storm's work is in terms of the notion of children's right to access culture that is relevant and socially meaningful to them, and the way in which that became a core value of the group. Pippi Storm was very much committed to ensuring the opportunity for all children to participate in its cultural programs. For that reason, it sought to keep any performance fees as low as possible, and it also set out to reach places where there were less opportunities for children to engage in theatre or other cultural activities. The group's regional activities were one early example of this, and they continued over time, but this one shows some very early tours that were undertaken. The map here is taken from the 1977-78 annual report of the group, and you can see here that tours were undertaken through various parts of regional New South Wales and also through the Northern Territory and Western Australia. And this is a photograph from that tour, from performances that were undertaken in Aboriginal communities. On the right here, you see a poster from their work in Minto in 1985, so taking us forward here several years, which was reflective of a shift in the group to really focusing on Western Sydney from the early 1980s onwards. So from the early 1980s, they undertook projects in areas that included Mount Druitt, Villawood, Liverpool, and Minto. You see the poster here for one of those activities, and also in the Green Valley Housing Commission in the Liverpool area. These areas were a focus of increased government resourcing at the time due to the implementation of the Western Sydney Area Assistance Scheme in 1979. And one of the real highlights that I came across in the library's collection quite early on in my research was a scrapbook documenting a 1984 project in Green Valley. This project involved teaching a group of children stilt walking in preparation for the Children's Day Festival in Liverpool that year. In 1980, sorry, it was from 1984. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. The scrapbook that was prepared includes many photos from the work that was undertaken in the lead up to the festival, and it also includes some written reflections from Pippi Storm members about the work. And there they really emphasise the broader value of working with communities and thinking about the types of culture that are meaningful to children themselves. They comment, maybe our kids haven't heard of Shakespeare or Beethoven or opera, but they can appreciate walking proud in a colourful local parade, constructing themselves in bright showy pants, painting their faces, cooperating together to achieve an impact, a little drama. They go on, working in the West has to be an aim of its own, not a distorted and whimsical nonsense of stepping stones to high culture and the opera's paradise. I think those quotes really speak to the notion that that working in local communities, as I said, and thinking about what's meaningful to children themselves was more important than bringing a particular form of culture to children, or expecting them to conform to what might be considered the right type of culture by society more broadly. So these are just some of the examples of Pippi Storm's work, really only a taste of the very ambitious programs that they undertook during this period. What they've highlighted to me is the ways in which children's theatre could be used as a way to engage children and young people themselves, both in explicit discussions around children's rights, as we see in the Says Who performance, but also how theatre could be a way to engage children and put children's rights principles into practice in more implicit ways. Their work shows how children's theatre could also be a way of reaching a much broader audience than perhaps some other forms of activism. And I haven't compiled all the figures yet, but the reach of their work was extensive. You've seen already here their reach beyond, say, the Sydney metropolitan area, but also simply the numbers of shows that they put on meant that they reached thousands and thousands of children over the course of their history. In turn, I think that a group like Pippi Storm is one that can tell us more about the importance of cultural activism as a way of engaging people in questions around social justice and around children's rights in particular. And for that reason, I think that there's value in thinking more generally about cultural activism as a vehicle for exploring ideas about children's rights and how they've changed over the course of the last decades. That's something that I intend to do as part of the continuing work that I'm doing both on Pippi Storm itself and on the history of children's rights in my broader research project. So I will leave it there for today, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and your questions.
Thanks so much, Isabel. So somebody is saying in relation to that comment that you just had up on the screen there about Shakespeare, that their memories of theatre at school were very much Shakespeare and plays that they needed to study as part of the higher school certificate. Are there any groups that are filling the space of the political activism that you've spoken about today?
That's a great question, and I have to say it's not something that I've specifically explored in terms of what current groups are doing, but clearly the sort of history documented here is one that does raise questions for us about contemporary children's rights issues, whether they're the question of children's access to culture or other children's rights issues, and how they might be something that can be explored through theatre and other cultural works. My sense would be that there would be groups that are trying to do this kind of work still today. I'm sorry that I can't give you sort of specific examples of them, but my sense would be that there is a longer legacy here from this kind of work. And I think too, we can actually see shifts in the kind of curriculum that we see in schools today too. So that these kind of ideas have led to a reshaping of what kind of cultural products are being looked at in schools, in English lessons, for example. So I think that there is certainly a kind of a longer legacy here.
And somebody's asking about how you mentioned that you came across this collection while you were working on your book, and a couple of people are asking when specifically the book will be out, so we might get you to talk a little bit more about that project as well. But were you surprised to find this collection at the library and to find that it was such a detailed collection?
Yes, I was definitely, I mean, that's why it stood out for me, and it's not the only collection of theatre groups, for example, at the library. But certainly when I found it and realised how extensive it was, it really made me think that it was something worth exploring further. I know I spoke already a little bit about what's in the collection, but to give you a sense, there's 23 boxes of written records. And I mean, compared to other groups that I've looked at in my research, that's a pretty big collection. Even though I think probably over time more contemporary groups do tend to generate a lot of paperwork, this one does stand out for me. So, and as I said, in addition, there are also films associated with the group that are held by the library. So it is a very, very rich collection. Was that the general question?
Yep. So
Rachel, yes, that did really stand out. And I guess in looking at it, as I said, there are just some real highlights in the collection in terms of things like the scrapbooks, which I think just give a more intimate understanding of the group's work than annual reports, which are very important in terms of being able to put together a chronology of the group's work and so on, and certainly make that part of working on its history easier, but it's some of those more kind of material objects that are really exciting to find.
Yeah, people are saying they were really excited to see some of the ephemera and an extension of the creativity on the stage, but as a small performing arts group relying on funding, someone made the comment that even though it was a few years ago, the ticket prices, they were only sort of like $1 to $4, and so that other type of creativity of doing a lot of the design and the advertising yourself. So people were saying they're really pleased to see that.
I think too, just to mention there too, there are other materials in the collection too that things like resource books that were produced that were intended to mean that teachers, for example, could put these activities into practice in their own classrooms, not just relying on the group, for example. So they provided guides that would enable, I guess, a wider range of people to undertake this work. And during this period, you're also seeing other groups do that kind of thing. So Reverse Garbage in Sydney, for example, was putting out guides on how to produce your own toys and games for kids using, just sort of things you might have at home that you could recycle. So that kind of creativity, yes, is very much evident in the work, and sort of encouraging that creativity more generally in the community is part of what is taking place here.
Someone's asking a really interesting question about reaction and backlash, and some of the shows and the themes that were created in Pippi Storm that you've spoken about today would probably create quite a stir if they were put on in schools now. So some of the examples cited here are True Love about sexuality, and Either You Have It or You Don't about drug use. Are you surprised that these plays were allowed to be performed in schools and some of the discussions? I mean, you raised some really interesting evaluation feedback in your presentation today. You surprised that all of that was actually allowed to unfold?
Thanks for that question. It sounds like it probably came from someone who was either part of the group or who saw some of these performances at the time. And I think they did create controversy sometimes as well. I did come across one letter, for example, regarding You Have It or You Don't, which is a play dealing with drugs and alcohol, but also which seeks to raise questions not just about illegal drugs, but legal drugs, and sort of challenge that division and why it exists. And there are lots of letters written in support of the play, but there were a few that took issue with the subject. One letter that I came across in particular that said that it had generated a lot of concern from parents and teachers subsequent to the performance. And I think that letter certainly indicated that the message was not always welcomed, but equally, there are many letters that said in support of these performances. And I guess that also speaks to the way in which children's theatre was a way in which those subjects could be addressed in ways that were less threatening for teachers and schools sometimes. Sometimes having someone external come in to generate these discussions made it easier for them to take place in schools. And also, I think an effort was made to try and look at issues from a range of different perspectives in the interests of not presenting a sort of doctrinaire approach, if you like. So I think those were some strategies that were also used by the group to make sure that there was, I guess, to facilitate a more positive action to the plays, even though they were raising controversial issues. And in terms of what the question was pointing at there in terms of how they might be received today, I agree that these are issues that would still create controversy in schools today. They show that even though in some ways these are issues that we are more likely to discuss, they're also still flashpoints of debate.
Somebody's asking who's not very familiar with the company if the majority of their performances were for primary school students, or were they more often going into high schools with these quite complicated themes?
They performed both in primary schools and secondary schools, but the plays that were offered differed across the two kind of sectors, and also some plays were intended for certain year groups more than others. I should say also that I'm not entirely sure for the earlier period, something I need to get a better sense of from some of the members of the group, whether permission was required formally from the Department of Education to show plays, but certainly by the 1980s there were formal processes needed to get accreditation before plays could be offered in government schools at least. So that's something that had to be considered. And also, I guess in that context, I think it was for you have it or you haven't, there was actually a requirement to remove swear words from the play before permission was granted for it to be shown. It could have been for another play, I'm not sure, but that's is telling of the ways in which compromises did have to be made in the process. Yes, different performances were targeted to different age groups, but there were some commonalities there in terms of the types of theatre offered, the emphasis, for example, on circus skills, and in terms of that skills development, that was something that was undertaken both in primary schools and secondary schools.
And one of the group members has just chipped in and said that they also went into infant schools. So
yes, and I guess childcare centres too, if that's as well. That was a component of their work too, was doing activities with childcare centres. In fact, I did come across a reference to my own childcare centre that I went to, although it would have been a few years before I attended, but it was a nice moment for me to see it mentioned there and think about the fact that these were sort of projects that were taking place in my own sort of childhood, or just that would have influenced, I think, probably some of the practices in the centres that I went to.
It's such a terrific idea, theatre for children and young people. Thank you so much for spending all the time. I remember seeing you in the Mitchell reading room, patiently going through all the boxes and the trolleys of material. So thank you for your work. Thank you for sharing it with so many of us today. And if you are wanting to stay in the 70s and 80s, you can join us for our next Scholar Talk, when Associate Professor Claire Monagle will be talking about the spiritual is political and Christian feminism in Australia in the 1970s and 80s. That's the next Scholar Talk, 11 o'clock on Tuesday, the 1st of June. So I hope to see you then. Thank you everyone so much for coming. Bye-bye.